The Washington family drove through Millbrook, Alabama on their way to visit relatives and never arrived at their destination. Their car was found burned out in the town square at dawn, suitcases still packed in the trunk. No witnesses came forward. No investigations launched. No questions asked. For 40 years, Millbrook buried its secret until the grandson returned and discovered evidence that would expose the entire town. What he found will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice. August 12, 2014, 2:47 p.m. Michael Washington Jr. stepped out of his rental car into the suffocating heat of an Alabama summer, feeling the weight of 40 years pressing down on him like the humidity that made his shirt stick to his back. The town square of Millbrook looked exactly like the photographs he'd studied for decades, except smaller, more tired, more desperate to hold onto a past that should have been buried with the people it had killed. The Confederate monument still dominated the center of the square, its bronze soldier facing north in eternal defiance of a war lost a century and a half ago. But it was the patch of asphalt at the monument's base that drew Michael's attention. Fresh asphalt, laid sometime in the past few years, covering the exact spot where his family's 1972 Buick Skylark had been found burned to its frame on July 16, 1974. Even the ground was trying to hide the truth. Michael pulled out his grandfather's journal, the leather cover worn smooth by 40 years of his own searching fingers. The pages contained everything the Detroit police had gathered about the disappearance. Witness statements that led nowhere. Official reports that said nothing. Photographs of a burned car that raised more questions than answers. But most importantly, it contained the names. Robert Washington, 35. Mary Washington, 32. Michael Washington, 12. Angela Washington, 8. Baby Thomas Washington, 18 months. His uncle, aunt, and cousins who'd vanished while driving through this town that looked like it had never seen a black family and intended to keep it that way. The townspeople watched him from storefront windows and shaded porches, their stares carrying the same hostility their parents and grandparents had perfected in 1974. Michael had expected this. He'd prepared for it during 3 years of research that had brought him from Detroit newsrooms to civil rights archives to the doorstep of a town that had spent 4 decades perfecting the art of amnesia. "You lost, son?" The voice belonged to Police Chief Tommy Morrison, grandson of a sheriff who'd been in charge when the Washington family disappeared. At 35, Tommy had inherited more than just his grandfather's badge. He'd inherited his grandfather's secrets, his grandfather's methods, and his grandfather's understanding that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. Michael smiled with the professional courtesy he'd learned during 10 years as an investigative journalist. "Not lost, Chief. I'm exactly where I need to be. I'm Michael Washington Jr., and I'm here about my family." The recognition flickered across Morrison's face like summer lightning. Quick, bright, and immediately followed by the kind of darkness that comes before storms. "Mister, I don't know what you've heard about this town, but I can tell you right now that you're wasting your time. Whatever happened to your people, it didn't happen here." But Michael had heard this denial before, in phone calls and letters and official statements that all said the same thing. Millbrook, Alabama, was a peaceful town where nothing bad ever happened to anyone, especially not to black families who'd made the mistake of stopping for gas on a summer day in 1974. The difference was that this time, Michael hadn't come just to ask questions. He'd come because someone in this town was finally ready to answer them. And what Emma Lou Harris had told her granddaughter before dying would prove that some secrets are too heavy for an entire town to carry forever. Robert Washington had built the American dream with his bare hands and a teacher's salary. In the summer of 1974, he stood in his Detroit driveway, loading suitcases into their 1972 Buick Skylark, metallic blue with white racing stripes, and felt the pride that comes from proving every racist wrong. At 35, he was one of the few black teachers in an integrated Michigan school, earning respect from colleagues who'd initially questioned whether a man from rural Alabama could handle suburban Detroit students. But it was more than professional success that made Robert's chest swell as he checked the oil and tire pressure one final time. It was the knowledge that his children would never know the limitations he'd grown up with. 12-year-old Michael was already talking about becoming a doctor, inspired by Dr. King's speeches about service and dignity. 8-year-old Angela drew pictures of integrated classrooms where children of all colors learned together. And baby Thomas, barely walking but already babbling in the confident voice of a child who'd never been told he didn't belong anywhere. Mary Washington emerged from their brick house on Detroit's west side, carrying a cooler packed with sandwiches and sweet tea for the long drive south. At 32, she'd transformed herself from a Montgomery nurse who'd walked during the bus boycott into a Detroit mother who volunteered with the NAACP youth programs. Her civil rights background was no secret. She wore it like armor, teaching her children that they had not just rights, but responsibilities to continue the fight for justice. "Mama's going to cry when she sees how big Thomas has gotten," Mary said, settling into the passenger seat with the satisfaction of a woman who'd successfully raised her family far from the suffocating racism of her Alabama childhood. They made this trip every summer, visiting Mary's elderly mother in Montgomery, connecting their Detroit-born children to Southern roots that represented both pain and perseverance. The children loaded into the back seat with the excited energy that comes before long car trips. Michael carried a school project about family history, planning to interview his grandmother about life before civil rights. Angela had spent weeks creating artwork as gifts for cousins she saw once a year. Baby Thomas clutched his favorite stuffed animal, a brown teddy bear that would travel from Detroit to Alabama and back safely, unlike the family who'd given it to him. Robert had mapped their route carefully, as he did every year. Highway 65 south through Kentucky and Tennessee, avoiding the small towns where black travelers still weren't welcome after dark. They'd stop for gas and food in larger cities where their Michigan license plates and middle-class appearance wouldn't draw dangerous attention. The only uncertain stop was Millbrook, Alabama, a small town where they'd never stopped before but might need to fuel up depending on traffic and timing. "It's just gas and go," Robert told Mary as they pulled out of their driveway that Tuesday morning. "We'll be in Montgomery by dinner time." The Buick's engine hummed with the reliability that Robert had paid extra for, carrying a family toward what should have been another routine summer visit. In the trunk, carefully packed beneath their suitcases, were gifts that represented their Detroit success. Toys from Hudson's department store for the cousins, a silk scarf for grandmother, and photographs of their integrated neighborhood to show how far they'd all traveled from the segregated world Mary had fled 20 years earlier. As they drove south through the changing landscape, from Detroit's industrial skyline to Kentucky's rolling hills to Alabama's cotton fields, the Washington family carried with them the confidence of people who'd made it, who'd built something permanent, who'd earned their place in American society through education, hard work, and unwavering dignity. None of them could have imagined that their success itself would mark them for death in a town that still measured a black family's worth by how quickly they could be made to disappear. July 15th, 1974, 3:30 p.m. The fuel gauge on Robert Washington's Buick Skylark hovered just above empty as the Alabama heat shimmered off Highway 31 like waves of malice. Millbrook appeared through the heat distortion ahead, a cluster of buildings arranged around a town square that looked like it had been frozen in 1954 and left to bake in the summer sun. "We need gas, honey," Mary said, though her voice carried the hesitation that every black traveler knew in 1974. Small Alabama towns were dice rolls. Some had adapted to integration with grudging acceptance. Others remained locked in the past, where a black family with Michigan plates represented everything they feared about a changing world. Robert guided the Buick toward Williams Gas Station, the only service station visible on the town square. The building was old but well-maintained, with hand-painted signs advertising Coca-Cola and motor oil. But it was the location that made Robert's chest tighten. Directly across from a Confederate monument that dominated the square like a stone finger pointed at the sky, warning everyone about the natural order of things. As they pulled up to the pumps, the town began to take notice. Conversations stopped on the courthouse steps. Rocking chairs went still on front porches. Even the dogs seemed to sense that something different had entered their world. Through the gas station window, Robert could see owner Pete Williams watching nervously, his face carrying the expression of a man who knew trouble when he saw it, but wasn't sure what to do about it. "Stay in the car," Robert told his family, but Mary was already opening her door. "The children need to use the restroom," she said with the quiet determination that had carried her through Montgomery bus boycotts. "We're customers here. We have rights." Rights. The word hung in the July air like a challenge that the gathering crowd of white residents wasn't sure how to answer. By 1974, federal law was clear about public accommodations. But federal law was something that happened in Washington, D.C., not in Millbrook, Alabama, where Sheriff Buck Morrison still carried himself like the overseer his grandfather had been. Morrison's patrol car materialized at the edge of the square as if summoned by some invisible signal. At 58, he was old enough to remember when handling uppity-colored folks was simple and legal, young enough to adapt to new methods that achieved the same results. He watched the Washington family through aviator sunglasses that reflected the Confederate monument like twin mirrors of unchanging purpose. Pete Williams approached Robert's car with the careful shuffle of a man walking a tightrope between federal law and local expectations. "Help you folks?" he asked, his voice carrying decades of practiced deference to white authority and confusion about how to address successful black customers. "Fill it up, please," Robert said, stepping out of the car with the confident posture of a man who'd earned his place in the world. His clothes were pressed despite the long drive. His shoes were polished. His children were well-behaved. Everything about the Washington family screamed middle-class respectability. And in 1974 Millbrook, that was exactly the problem. Mary emerged from a restroom with Angela and Michael, all three carrying themselves with the dignity that civil rights leaders had taught was both armor and target. Baby Thomas babbled happily in Mary's arms, unaware that his existence, a black child growing up free and confident, represented everything the watching crowd believed was wrong with America. Sheriff Morrison spoke into his radio, his words inaudible, but his meaning clear to anyone who understood the language of power. The gathering crowd grew larger, but remained carefully dispersed, creating the illusion of casual interest rather than coordinated surveillance. As Pete Williams finished fueling the Buick, his hands shook slightly while handling Robert's money. $23 for gas, snacks, and cold drinks. A normal transaction between normal people. Except nothing about this moment was normal in a town where normal meant that black families passed through quickly and quietly, if they passed through at all. "Y'all drive safe now," Pete said, the words carrying more warning than courtesy. But as the Washington family prepared to leave Millbrook behind, Sheriff Morrison's patrol car moved to block their path. Not obviously, not dramatically, just a routine traffic position that would require them to stop, to answer questions, to provide identification in a town where being black and successful was probable cause for whatever came next. July 15th, 1974, 4:15 p.m. Sheriff Buck Morrison's patrol car pulled in behind the Washington family's Buick as they attempted to leave Millbrook's town square. Not a pursuit, not a chase, just the methodical positioning of a predator who understood that patience was more effective than panic when dealing with prey that couldn't run far enough or fast enough to escape. Robert Washington checked his rearview mirror and felt his stomach drop. 30 years of living black in America had taught him to read the signs. The sheriff's deliberate speed. The backup patrol car that appeared from nowhere to block the road ahead. The radio chatter that crackled through open police car windows, coordinating something that had nothing to do with traffic enforcement. "What's happening, Daddy?" 12-year-old Michael asked from the back seat, his voice carrying the confusion of a child who'd grown up in integrated Detroit, where police were supposed to help people, not hunt them. "Just stay calm, son," Robert said, though his own hands were trembling as he pulled over to the shoulder of the empty road 2 miles outside Millbrook. Through his windshield, he could see cotton fields stretching endlessly toward a horizon that suddenly seemed impossibly far away. No weaknesses, no help. No federal laws that mattered when you were alone with men who'd never accepted that the old ways were supposed to be dead. Sheriff Morrison approached the driver's side window with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned the road, the law, and the people traveling through his territory. At 58, he carried himself like someone who remembered when dealing with uppity-colored folks was simple and legal, and who'd spent the past decade adapting those methods to new circumstances. License and registration, Morrison said, though his eyes weren't focused on Robert. They were cataloging the family, the well-dressed children, the educated woman in the passenger seat, the Michigan plates that marked them as outsiders who'd forgotten their place. Y'all seem to be lost. Robert handed over his documents with the careful politeness that black men had perfected as a survival skill. No, sir, we're not lost. Just passing through on our way to Montgomery to visit family. Morrison studied the license like it contained state secrets, taking his time while 2 more patrol cars arrived to complete the circle. 6 officers for one family. Professional overkill that suggested this wasn't a random traffic stop, but a coordinated operation that had been planned the moment the Washington family stopped for gas. Step out of the vehicle, boy, Morrison said, the word boy carrying 40 years of conditioning designed to strip away Robert's teacher credentials, his father's status, his basic humanity. Need to check the car for drugs and weapons. Mary Washington reached for her husband's arm. Robert, we haven't done anything wrong. We have rights. Rights. There was that word again. Sheriff Morrison smiled at hearing it, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Ma'am, you're in Alabama now. Rights are what I say they are. What happened next would be reconstructed 40 years later through the testimony of a single witness who'd been too terrified to speak until she was dying. Emma Lou Harris, working as a maid for Mayor Hayes, would eventually reveal that she'd watched from the cotton field where she'd been picking late-season bulls for extra money. She'd seen the Washington family ordered out of their car at gunpoint. She'd witnessed the systematic loading of 5 people into police vehicles like cargo being transported to an invisible destination. But in 1974, Emma Lou had done what black women in Alabama had learned to do when witnessing things they weren't supposed to see. She'd pressed herself flat against the cotton rows and prayed that the men with badges wouldn't notice her watching their carefully choreographed elimination of a family whose only crime was existing with dignity. By 5 p.m., the road was empty except for the abandoned Buick sitting on the shoulder like evidence of something that powerful people intended to pretend had never happened. The Washington family had vanished into a system designed to make inconvenient people disappear without paperwork, without questions, and without the kind of investigations that might embarrass important men. 12 hours later, their burned car would be discovered in Millbrook's town square, positioned like a warning to any other black families who might mistake Alabama hospitality for acceptance. But the people who'd been inside that car would be gone forever, buried in a place that wouldn't be found for 40 years, by a grandson who refused to accept that some injustices were too old to prosecute. July 18, 1974. Margaret Washington sat in the Montgomery Law Office of Attorney James Powell, her aged hands clutching a photograph of her daughter's family while tears streamed down her cheeks. 3 days had passed since Mary and her children were supposed to arrive for their annual visit. 3 days of calling hospitals, police stations, and anyone who might have seen a 1972 Buick with Michigan plates traveling through Alabama. Mrs. Washington, I understand your concern, Powell said, his voice carrying the careful patience of a civil rights lawyer who'd handled too many cases like this. But without evidence of foul play, Alabama authorities are treating this as a missing persons case. Adults have the right to change their travel plans. Margaret's voice shook with fury and grief. Mr. Powell, my daughter has called me every single day for the past 15 years. She would never just disappear without word. And those children, Robert was bringing them to see me graduate from high school. They were excited about visiting. Powell had filed dozens of civil rights cases during the 1960s. He understood the patterns. Black families who vanished while traveling through hostile territories. Investigations that stalled when witnesses refused to cooperate. Federal authorities who deferred to local jurisdiction until media attention forced their hand. But 1974 was supposed to be different. Civil rights laws were in place. The world was watching. Surely a middle-class family from Detroit couldn't simply disappear without consequences. He was wrong. The Alabama State Police report when it finally arrived, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic indifference. The Washington family's burned car had been found in Millbrook's town square on July 16th. No bodies, no signs of foul play. Local authorities suggested the family had staged the incident for insurance purposes or civil rights publicity. Case closed. This is impossible, Powell told his secretary after reading the report. A family doesn't burn their own car and disappear with 3 children for publicity. Something happened in Millbrook. But when Powell tried to investigate, he encountered walls of silence that seemed professionally constructed. The gas station owner claimed no memory of serving any black family. Town residents insisted they'd seen nothing unusual on July 15th. Sheriff Morrison's report stated that no black family had been stopped or questioned by his department. Most disturbing of all, the federal investigators seemed unusually reluctant to challenge local authority. FBI agent Patricia Moore, assigned to the case, told Powell that civil rights violations required evidence of federal crimes. Local disappearances fall under state jurisdiction, she explained, though her tone suggested she didn't believe her own words. The Detroit community rallied around the Washington family's disappearance with the intensity of people who understood that it could have been any of them. Robert's school colleagues organized fundraising drives. Mary's church held prayer vigils. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund filed federal lawsuits demanding investigation. But every legal avenue led to the same dead end: Millbrook, Alabama, where an entire town seemed to have developed collective amnesia about July 15, 1974. Private investigator Marcus Johnson, hired by the Detroit community, lasted exactly 4 days in Millbrook before Sheriff Morrison escorted him to the county line with a warning about outside agitators stirring up trouble. Johnson's report was chilling in its brevity. Local law enforcement is hostile to investigation. Residents claim no knowledge of incident. Recommend federal intervention or case will remain unsolved. Federal intervention never came. By September 1974, media attention had shifted to other stories. The civil rights lawsuit was dismissed for lack of evidence, and the Washington family became another statistical footnote in the long history of black Americans who disappeared into the machinery of Southern justice. Margaret Washington lived 15 more years, dying in 1989 without ever learning what happened to her daughter and grandchildren. Every night, until the end, she set 5 extra places at her dinner table, hoping that tomorrow would be the day they finally came home. The Detroit community never forgot. Robert Washington Elementary School was named in his honor. Mary Washington's nursing scholarship continued supporting young black women entering healthcare. And Michael, Angela, and Thomas Washington's names were added to civil rights memorials, though their bodies were never found for burial. But in Millbrook, Alabama, the summer of 1974 simply didn't exist in official memory. And 6 men carried a secret that would poison their souls for 40 years, until one witness finally found the courage to speak from her deathbed. 40 years is a long time to carry blood on your hands, especially when that blood belongs to children who'd never had the chance to grow up and threaten anyone. By 2010, most of the men who participated in the Washington family murders were dead, taking their secrets to graves that would be marked with flowers and American flags, honored as pillars of a community built on buried bones. Sheriff Buck Morrison died in 1998, his funeral attended by hundreds of Millbrook residents who praised his dedication to law and order. His eulogy made no mention of July 15, 1974, or the family whose blood had stained his uniform 40 years later. But his widow, Sarah Morrison, carried a different burden. She'd washed those bloodstains out of her husband's clothes the night he came home from his special assignment, and she'd spent 20 years waiting for federal investigators who never came. Mayor Gerald Hayes lived until 2005, developing dementia that loosened his tongue in dangerous ways. During his final years at Millbrook Care Center, he'd ramble to nurses about the nigger family that wouldn't know their place, and teaching lessons that needed teaching. The staff dismissed his words as the confused ravings of an aging mind, but his granddaughter Jessica began keeping a journal of his confessions, sensing they were too specific to be fantasy. The gas station owner Pete Williams became a broken man after 1974, drinking himself into an early grave by 1987. His guilt manifested as paranoia that made him jump at every car backfire, every unexpected knock on his door. His wife told neighbors that Pete talked in his sleep about choosing the wrong side and children who didn't deserve what happened. But in small-town Alabama, a widow's grief was easier to dismiss than a conspiracy that implicated half the town's leadership. Emma Lou Harris carried the heaviest burden of all. As the Hayes family's domestic worker for 37 years, she'd cleaned the blood from the mayor's clothes, burned the photographs he'd taken as trophies, and listened to phone calls coordinating the cover-up. She'd watched federal investigators come and go, always stopping short of asking the right questions to the right people. They knew. Emma Lou would whisper to her granddaughter Denise during their Sunday dinners. Those FBI men knew something was wrong, but they didn't want to know too much. Easier to let sleeping dogs lie when those dogs bite back. By 2000, Millbrook had transformed its shame into tourist revenue. The Confederate monument was cleaned and restored. The town square hosted antique festivals and Civil War reenactments. Brochures celebrated Old South charm and traditional values, attracting visitors who found romance in a past that had been anything but romantic for families like the Washingtons. But the new generation carried fragments of inherited guilt. Children who'd grown up hearing whispered conversations between parents. Grandchildren who'd found old photographs hidden in attics. Great-grandchildren who sensed that their family's comfortable life had been built on something terrible that couldn't be discussed. Michael Washington Jr. arrived in Millbrook carrying 40 years of unanswered questions and the stubborn determination of a man who'd inherited more than just his uncle's name. As an investigative journalist for the Detroit Free Press, he'd spent 3 years preparing for this moment, building sources and gathering evidence that painted a very different picture of what happened in 1974. His research had uncovered patterns that federal investigators had somehow missed. Land ownership records showing suspicious property transfers immediately after the murders. Financial records indicating large cash payments to key witnesses. Medical records from the local emergency room showing treatment for hunting accidents that perfectly matched defensive wounds. Most importantly, Michael Jr. had found Emma Lou Harris. At 89, she was dying of kidney failure, and the weight of carrying Millbrook's secret had become heavier than her fear of the consequences of speaking. Her granddaughter Denise had contacted Michael Jr. through social media, sharing fragments of stories that Emma Lou had whispered during her increasingly frequent hospital stays. "Mima keeps talking about a family that got killed," Denise had written in her message. "She says she saw it happen, and she's been carrying the secret her whole life. She wants to tell someone before she dies, but she's scared of what might happen to our family." Michael Jr. understood that fear. He'd grown up with stories of civil rights workers who'd been murdered for asking the wrong questions. But he also understood that some truths were too important to die with the people who witnessed them. And Emma Lou Harris was ready to trade her silence for the peace that only justice could bring. August 15th, 2014. Emma Lou Harris lay in her hospital bed at Montgomery General, her voice barely a whisper, but her memory crystal clear as she recounted the most horrible day of her life. Michael Washington Jr. sat beside her, recording every word on his phone while her granddaughter Denise held her frail hand. "I was picking cotton in the Hayes field that evening," Emma Lou began, her eyes closed but seeing everything as clearly as if it were yesterday. "Working late to earn extra money for my children's school clothes. That's when I seen Sheriff Morrison's cars surrounding your family on that back road." Michael Jr. leaned closer, his heart pounding as 40 years of questions finally began finding answers. "They made your uncle and aunt get out first," Emma Lou continued, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Then the children. That little baby was crying something fierce. Sheriff Morrison, he was giving orders like he was conducting some kind of military operation." She described details that only someone who'd witnessed horror could know. The way Robert Washington had tried to shield his children with his body. How Mary had begged them to take her instead of hurting the babies. The systematic execution that followed, carried out by 6 men wearing badges and the authority those badges provided. "They drove the bodies to the old Hayes farm," Emma Lou whispered. Bury them in that back field where nobody ever goes. Made me help carry the little ones because they said if I told anybody, they'd put me and my babies in the ground right next to them. Michael Jr.'s hands shook as he processed what she was telling him. His family hadn't died in some random act of violence. They'd been systematically murdered by law enforcement officers who'd spent 40 years being honored as community pillars. Mr. Hayes, he took pictures, Emma Lou said, her voice growing stronger as the burden began lifting from her shoulders. Kept them in a shoebox under his bed like trophies. Made me dust around them every week, reminding me what happened to colored folks who got too uppity. The photographs still existed, Emma Lou revealed. Hidden in the Hayes mansion's attic after the mayor's death, preserved by a widow who'd been too afraid to destroy evidence, but too terrified to reveal it. Along with Sheriff Morrison's bloodstained uniform that Emma Lou had been ordered to clean, but had secretly kept as insurance against the men who'd threatened her family. 3 days later, Michael Jr. stood with FBI agents at the Hayes farm, watching ground-penetrating radar reveal what Emma Lou's confession had promised. Disturbed soil in the backfield. 5 sets of human remains buried in a mass grave. Personal belongings that confirmed what everyone had known, but no one had dared to say. The truth had finally come home to Millbrook, Alabama. And with it came the reckoning that 40 years of silence couldn't prevent forever. September 2014. The arrests came 40 years too late, but they came with the force of justice that had been building pressure like a dam ready to burst. 3 surviving members of Sheriff Morrison's execution squad were taken into custody by federal agents, their shocked faces captured by news cameras as they were led away from the comfortable retirement they'd never deserved. The evidence was overwhelming. Emma Lou Harris's testimony, corroborated by physical evidence she'd preserved for 4 decades. Photographs found in the Hayes mansion showing the crime scene and victims. Financial records proving payments to witnesses and participants. DNA analysis confirming the identity of remains found in the mass grave. Millbrook's carefully constructed mythology crumbled in a matter of weeks. The town that had marketed itself as a bastion of Southern charm was exposed as a community built on murder and maintained through collective silence. Property values plummeted. Tourism vanished. The Confederate monument in the town square became a symbol not of heritage, but of the hate that had killed an innocent family. The trial drew national attention to a courtroom where justice had been denied for 40 years. Michael Washington Jr. testified about his family's legacy, reading from his Uncle Robert's teaching evaluations and his Aunt Mary's civil rights work. Emma Lou Harris, though dying, appeared via video testimony that reduced hardened federal prosecutors to tears. They were good people, Michael Jr. told the packed courtroom. They believed in America's promise of equality and justice. They died because small men with badges couldn't accept that black families could be successful and dignified. The convictions brought life sentences for the surviving conspirators, but no amount of justice could restore the lives that had been stolen. The Washington family had missed 40 years of birthdays, graduations, weddings, and grandchildren they'd never meet. The town's reckoning was far from complete. Federal oversight transformed Millbrook's police department. A truth and reconciliation process forced residents to confront their community's history. The former Hayes farm became a memorial park where visitors could learn about the cost of silence in the face of injustice. Michael Washington Jr. returned to Detroit with his family's remains, finally able to hold the funeral that had been denied in 1974. The service drew thousands of people, including civil rights leaders who spoke about courage, persistence, and the power of truth to overcome even the most carefully constructed lies. Today, the Washington Family Memorial stands where the Confederate monument once dominated Millbrook's town square. Every year on July 15th, people gather to remember a family whose only crime was believing in the American dream while wearing the wrong skin color. And every year, Michael Jr. speaks about the importance of breaking silence, seeking truth, and ensuring that justice delayed doesn't become justice denied forever. The Washington family who drove into Millbrook, Alabama in 1974 proved that Black Americans would die simply for existing with dignity. and ultimately exposed a white supremacist conspiracy so extensive it required 40 years of silence and an entire town's complicity to conceal the full scope of their crimes against civil rights. Emma Lou Harris's deathbed confession, kept secret for 4 decades, finally revealed the hate that badges and political power died trying to conceal. The town square that hid systematic murder became a monument to the courage of one witness who chose truth over a lifetime of fear. How many other black families lie beneath Southern soil, their murders disguised as disappearances? What happens when entire communities coordinate to eliminate those who challenge racial hierarchies? Can democracy survive when seeking equality becomes a death sentence? Drop a comment below and let us know. Do you believe coordinated racial violence by local authorities still happens today? Hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more investigations that prove justice is more durable than silence.